Hello, welcome to FAIRtax Power Radio. I'm Bob Paxton,
I'm Bob Scarborough.
and we have a special guest with us today who is
John Linder.
John Linder. The FAIRtax people will no doubt recognize that name. He was the original sponsor of the FAIRtax bill when it was first introduced into Congress way back in the Stone Age almost. And he co-wrote the books with Neil Bortz, the two FAIRtax books. So, John, I certainly appreciate your time and effort to speak with us today.
Happy to be here.
All right. Well, let's dig right in, and I'm going to kind of start by going out on a limb here. This is a bit of an occupational hazard of pre-recording the podcast. We're actually recording this on the 13th. It's going to stream on the 24th. That's 11 days, and a lot can happen in that time. So hopefully what I want to talk about here doesn't become horribly outdated in that time. But I'm looking now at what's going on in Washington relative to trying to get a new Speaker of the House. And I'm kind of expecting Larry, Moe, and Curley to show up at just about any time. But there have been four names so far. The two big ones, Steve Scalise and Jim Jordan, who have been the two big names in the process so far. There's also been Kevin Hern and Tom Emmer. My question to you, John, is did you get a chance to work with any of these guys? None of them are FAIRtax co-sponsors, but did you get a chance to work with any of them when the FAIRtax was your bill? And do you have any insight on how they may feel about the FAIRtax?
I worked with both Jim Jordan and Steve Scalise, and I don't have any sense of how they might be on it, nor do I know if they're going to follow through on what Kevin McCarthy said when he was elected Speaker, which was there will be a vote on it. Subsequent to that, Kevin was asked whether he supported it. He said no. I would just like to make sure that somehow they have a very fair and open discussion about it in the Ways and Means Committee, and have an opportunity for people to testify and have a vote in the Ways and Means Committee at the very least. I have no sense of how that's going to come about.
What was it like in Congress when you were there? What's the resistance to a tax on consumption versus an income tax, and then further closing down the Internal Revenue Service? You were in Congress for a while. What was the sense at that time when you were bringing the bill into each session?
When we first introduced it, we said we're going to have one for every Republican, we're going to have a Democrat. And we got Colin Peterson from Minnesota to be a co-sponsor, and three others. And then a few of those left, and some switched to the Republican Party. And it got to the point where Nancy Pelosi put a stop to any Democrats being on the bill. And so we just loaded up the Republicans. And I think the highest point when Rob Woodall was handling the bill after I left, I think he had up to 74 signatures on it. The opposition to it was resistance to change. It took a little while to study it to understand how good it was. And there's great opposition in K Street, to the lobbying community, because about 50% of them make their living gaming the tax code. And if we got rid of the tax code, what were they to do? I'll give you some other examples of that. I spoke with the AICPA, which is an accountants organization, and a guy named Phil, a big burly guy named Phil, who used to be the executive director of the Joint Committee for Taxation, had retired and gone to work for one of the AICPA firms. And he was in this morning meeting that I spoke to, maybe 100 people from that group, and they hated it. And I could answer all their questions about it. But finally, Phil just stepped forward and said, John, just give me 3 more years. And that let me know exactly what they were thinking about. They're making money off the tax code, and they didn't want it changed. We had great resistance, for example, from the real estate organization. Well, we had great support from all realtors. Now, the realtors knew that the mortgage tax deduction is inconsequential as regards selling a new home. What really matters is how much take-home pay they had and whether they could afford the payment. But the real estate organization was formed and is one of the largest lobbying groups in Washington today. It was formed to protect the mortgage interest deduction. And if we're going to get rid of the tax code and not need that, what are they to do? They spent $100,000 to try and defeat me in the 2002 primary I had against Bob Barr. And another organization, there are 5 million farm families as part of the National Farm Bureau. And they overwhelmingly support it because most successful farmers spend hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to protect their farm should they die so their kids don't have to sell it.
Right.
And I would get rid of all that need. But the Farm Bureau Association in Washington, with several hundred people running it, was organized to try and get rid of the mortgage tax, the death tax, the income tax at death. They were organized to try and get rid of that. And if I was going to do it in one fell swoop, what are they to do? So all of the lobbyists throughout the organization in Washington. Now, who are these lobbyists? Well, they're the former staff members of Congress. And if anybody can have any influence on members of Congress, it's their former staff person who's now a fairly ranking person in one of these organizations.
And has a lot of cash to distribute.
Yes, yes. So there was constant opposition, but there was some interest among Black members of Congress, and they would come up and talk to me about it. And I think we get an interest there, but they could not sign on. They're just an embedded interest. It's going to have to be done from the outside. It's going to have to be done by someone like Trump, who is a disruptor. Now, it is said that someone approached him in 2016 about this tax. And he said, I can't go for that because I pay so much tax on income tax. People were thinking that I was trying to get rid of my tax burden. And my answer to that was he spends more money than he pays taxes on. We now know how much he pays in taxes, income taxes, which is very, very little. So that excuse will no longer fly. The best way to reach, I think, someone like Trump is to let him know that this will totally destroy downtown Washington's lobbying community. It will also bring work back on our shores. You probably know a study that Bill Archer used to quote often. There was an informal study of 500 international corporations located overseas, their headquarters, all with major business interests in the United States. When asked 80%, when they were asked this question, what would you do in their future if the American government eliminated all taxes on capital and labor and taxed only personal consumption? 80% said they'd build their next plant in the United States. 20% said they'd relocate their headquarters to the United States. Now, if you want to bring plants home, this is the way to do it. There are several $1 trillion in offshore financial centers that would be in our markets. The next day, I asked the head of the Federal Reserve, Greenspan, I said, what would happen to all the money offshore if we passed the fair tax? And he said, it would be in our banks within weeks or months. So it would be there for investing, for other people to borrow it and create jobs. There are virtually no downsides to this, and except for the fact that there's a lot of money to be made gaming the tax code. We now have seen the tax code weaponized, and the IRS, which is nothing but a large labor union, starting in 1912, I think it was, opened the door for, I criticized both McConnell and Boehner because the IRS opened the door wide open for us to step in and see how they live and what they do. And nobody stepped through that door. We had a bunch of hearings and it all went away. Adding $87,000 billion for thousands of more agents is not going to collect much more money, but it will create a lot more problems.
Well, I noticed when the book first came out and you and Bortz were doing media tours on it, there was a massive public reaction to it. I mean, tens of thousands of people showing up in downtown Atlanta to support of the fair tax when it was a new idea. How can we refire that back up if most of the people, I think, once they understand it, They demand it. That's kind of our slogan here on FairTax Power Radio. Can we rekindle the same kind of public interest that you saw when the book first came out?
You get one presidential candidate to talk about it, and it will be there. Those people aren't going away. They're still buying that book. That book was published in 2005, and it is still being purchased. It would be very easy to rekindle that support. Just get one presidential candidate to talk about it. In 2000 and, I think 3 or 4 or 5, no, 6. They ran against Jim DeMint. Do you remember that when he ran for the Senate? And he was for the FAIRtax.
I do.
And they just beat Jim up terribly. And I started making phone calls and talk radio in North Carolina. And he got a little upset with me because he wanted it to go away. And I said, Jim, this is going to help you. This is going to help you. After that election, sometime after that election, Nancy Pelosi and the chairman of their budget committee, John Spratt, held a press conference. And for an hour, they talked about the fair tax. They didn't call it that, but they just trashed it. They used all the Democrat talking points to trash it. Roll Call did a large story on it and never called me one time for a comment from my side. They just ran the Democrat points on it. Something important happened in that. One of the senior Democrat aides was asked what he thought about it. And he said, when the American people catch on to how simple and fair this is, we're toast. They know what we know. In 2002, I had a rather spirited primary against Bob Barr in my district. He decided to run in a district which 60% of the new district after reapportionment was still Gwinnett County, which was my county. And I didn't raise the fair tax once. At the very beginning, we decided that if we had an average turnout of about 37,000 people, I'd win. If we had a very low turnout, he had a chance. I'm talking about 20-some thousand people. 88,000 people voted in that primary. The previous record was 41,000. We did a poll afterwards to find out why so many people voted. 25% of the people who voted in the Republican primary were Democrats. They voted to save the fair tax. So the public is very much aware of this, and they're going to vote on it, but we've got to get somebody courageous enough to do it at the federal level, at presidential level. Nobody knows that Dick Armey wrote a book on the flat tax, but everybody knows that Steve Forbes was for it when he ran for president. Mike Huckabee in 2008 ran on the fair tax, and he won Iowa. And I was with him campaigning in South Carolina shortly after New Hampshire and then South Carolina. And I thought we were going to win there. And somebody on his campaign decided we'd take a weekend and fly to Michigan because there was some inkling that things were happening on his behalf in Michigan. I suggested we stay in South Carolina because that was the next one to win and we had a chance at it. We flew to Michigan and barely lost South Carolina. Fred Thompson was in that race and beat Mike up for the whole weekend, and Newt Gingrich barely defeated him in South Carolina. Now, I believe if Mike had won South Carolina, he'd have rolled into Florida with a lot of backing, two victories, and the fair tax would have been part of the discussion, if not most of it.
South Carolina's been pivotal in a number of elections for a number of people, including the current president. And you would think that, and of course we know why politicians and why Washington, D.C., K Street, et cetera, are the way they are. How difficult do you think it would be? And you mentioned this just a minute ago. What's the pivot point for former President Trump to include this in his campaign stops?
I don't know. I can't get to him. I've tried to reach him through several different sources. And the other one who could talk about it because he co-sponsored it was Ron DeSantis. And he'd see a little light firelight under his campaign if you did that. The story I'm getting from DeSantis people is that he's for it, but he doesn't think it should be part of the campaign, because when he ran for governor, he got beat up on it in the primary with all of the, you've heard the stories, he's going to add 23% to your cost of your medicines and your groceries, and et cetera. Trump actually came out with a commercial against DeSantis saying the same Democrat talking points. So I think it'd be difficult to get him to change now and move toward it. But whoever does choose to get to it and talk about it, I think will energize that base that we know is out there. Mm-hmm. Just before I retired in 2010, somebody did a poll, and I forget who did it, and I don't have a copy of it, but they explained the difference between taxing income and taxing consumption, and asked which one you would choose. And not a majority, but a hefty plurality of the responders said they would choose the sales tax. So I know two pollsters, Matt Towery, and I don't know personally the Trafalgar pollster, but I'm going to get to him. He's there in Atlanta. And to see if they'll include a question in some of their polls. I'll even pay for it if they'll include a question in some of their polls about the fair tax, and to see if we can generate some interest.
All right, let me switch gears here a little bit if I can. A couple of years ago, when CPAC was down here in Florida, there were a group of us FAIRtax volunteers sitting outside having lunch. Eric Bowling, who is now with Newsmax, I think he was still with Fox at that time, he walked by, gave us a big thumbs up, said, "Yeah, great FAIRtax, I love it." But you never hear him or anybody else in the media even mention the fair tax. Now, I have always suspected that the big media companies have a gag order against the fair tax. Do you have any insight that explains that? You would think that somebody like Neil Cavuto in the business media would understand, what a boon the fair tax would be for American business. Why is the media not talking about it?
I don't know, but Neil has interviewed me 2 or 3 times on it, and he seemed very positive about it. He wasn't critical at all. My guess is, I'll give you an example. We have Bernie Marcus, who founded Home Depot, is a very good friend, and I saw a lot of him and while I was at Congress. Mm-hmm. And he retired, and they replaced him with a guy from one of the senior guys at GE named Bob Nardelli. And I thought it was strange that I could never get to talk to Bob Nardelli. And then I discovered that he hired a person from the Retail Association in Washington, and they hated it. They all came to see me one day, all the people from the various big companies. And we sat in my office, and I said, they said, "We don't want to be the tax collectors for the United States." And I said, "You're already the tax collectors for 45 states. And I had assumed you probably all had computers now. This was like in 2008 or 9. Mm-hmm. And he said, "Of course we do." And I said, "Well, then it's a pretty simple way to do it. You just make a little adjustment on your computer, and that the amount will come out, and you send it to the government, just like you send it to the state. No big deal." But they hated it. And it's likely because some of their co-workers in their former offices were working for another company that hated it. All of Washington, D.C. hates it, and they share it. And then they go back to their companies, and they tell their companies to stay away from it. It's dangerous. I've spoken to a lot of folks about this, including a big speech at Heritage, and I just don't understand it. But a lot of people listen to that guy in Washington who used to work for the Ways and Means Committee. They think he knows something, and they just stay away from it.
I got a question for you. I'm trying to think about how to ask it. Well, actually, there's 2, but I'll reserve the second one for a moment or 2 from now. The National Chamber of Commerce, do they not see this as being a benefit to small businesses in their communities that are members of the NFIB, for example?
The Chamber of Commerce previous CEO was Tom Donahue. And I went and talked to him about it, and he got terribly excited. And I said, I mean, this is going to put money in people's pockets. The increase in purchasing power from both the rebate and the reduction in the cost of goods and services, because you get the embedded cost of the IRS out. I said, put money in people's pockets, and he got very excited about it, and invited me to come down and speak to his board. Now, his board of directors had about 100 people on it, and I'm sure it was mainly an advisory board, but they're meeting in Boca Raton, and he invited me to come down and give a speech to him. And so I did, and they were excited about it. And that's the last I ever heard. And there's a guy named Bruce Jostin who expected to be the income. He was the number 2 guy when Tom Donahue was hired, and Bruce was not very happy. But he was a long time Beltway guy. He had worked in Congress as a staffer. And I know that he's the one that convinced Tom, this is a dumb idea. It's out of the woods. No country does this. We got to be careful, stay away from something that's crazy. And Tom believed him. But it all comes from the former staffers in Washington.
Okay, so now the second part of that is probably I'm going to bring it out as a comment. So earlier we talked about all the associations and all the lobbyists and the people in Congress, et cetera, not being for this because it would essentially upset the gravy train, the apple cart, the way things go. Even some of the associations that purport to be champions and representatives of the very groups of people in the country that it would benefit.
Farmers, for example.
Yeah, farmers, people like me, 1 or 2, people that own a company. I spend a lot of time filling that shoebox up, with information and paperwork. And I always say on our program here that if you were able to get the psychological encumbrance of dealing with the Internal Revenue Service and all that goes along with it on an annual basis, there could be considerable innovation, not the least of which would be being able to compete, pay people more. They would instantly get their a raise in their paycheck because the deductions would be gone. And young people tend to be more receptive than older people do, maybe because they aren't as in the routine of the tax cycle.
I had the notion of, you still have the Social Security tax under the FAIRtax calculated by your income. And my plan was always to change that and have everybody get the same Social Security check, which was the average check. And I would talk to this with people, and folks over 60 didn't want anything changed because they'd paid for a long time into Social Security. But everybody under 55 or 50 said they'd take it in a second because they don't expect to get anything from Social Security. And they'd be surprised with $1,500 a month, which is about average, $1,600. But they wouldn't have to pay in as much as they're paying in now, which is, most people understand, they're paying in 15% of their wages, 15.65%. And most people understand that are making $100,000 at $15,000, they're never going to see it. So they'd be thrilled to just drop out of the current system and not get any money in the future, and everybody just get the same average check in the future. You'd have to work it through the system so that people who are 64 would get what they expect to get, et cetera. But I think that can be fixed and get Social Security totally walked away from by individuals making their own choices. The young people will go for anything that will simplify their life, and they think that taxes are horrendous. And most of them know that the FICA tax is the biggest tax of all.
Absolutely. And my son feels that way. And he and I talk about this a lot. And he grew up around me, around talking about all this and talking with local representatives, et cetera. Do you think Congress is serious about finding a real solution to the problem of illegal tax evasion? And of course, are they just sitting on that as a reason to justify more spending and more government?
No, they don't need any reason to justify more spending and more government. They're just going to do it anyway. The tax gap is somewhere in the range of $700 billion now, money that we know is owed and is not paid. But when I try and talk to people about this, I talk to them about all the people who are legally avoiding taxes now. You know, no rich people. You saw Donald Trump's tax returns when they were finally released, and he paid one year he paid about 35 or 40 million in taxes, and I think that was the one that got slipped in the middle of the night to Rachel Maddow. And when it happened, I believe Trump probably released it himself, because all the rest of them were $0 or $750 a year in taxes. And I don't blame him, because people who are wealthy have good tax lawyers and good tax accountants, and they have high deductibles because of depreciation on buildings and things. They all spend more money than they pay taxes on earning, and they would pay taxes on it. But I was reading some stuff on the internet and saw some images of the numbers of people coming across the river right now. And my thought was, they had 14,000 in one day here this week. They'd all be taxpayers.
Mm-hmm.
They'd all be taxpayers.
Even today. I mean,
yes.
Yeah, immediately.
Immediately, they would be paying taxes. Even if the money was given to the government, we'll fight that on another battlefront, but they'd be paying taxes on everything they bought. We have a huge amount of money, $3 trillion in offshore financial, and $3 trillion under the table. $3 trillion a year under the table with, it's not all drug money, it's the lady who cleans your house and the guy who mows the yard. There's a lot of that that's never paid taxes on. There's 21 trillion offshore financial centers that would be relocated in our markets and our centers immediately. We're just avoiding all that. Monaco, did you know that Monaco has our tax system, the fair tax? They don't call it that, but it's not an ad valorem tax. It's just a sales tax, just like we have, like we propose. And they do fine. A lot of wealthy people move there, and they spend their money there. There's very little downsides. We just need to find that one presidential candidate who will make it part of the campaign.
Oh, mercy. Well, I hope we can do that. I was hoping that the back and forth between Trump and DeSantis over this would bring it more into the forefront, but so far that hasn't really happened. But gentlemen, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave that right about here, because we are slap out of time for this edition of FAIRtax Power Radio. John, again, thank you so much for your efforts on behalf of the FAIRtax when you were in Congress, your continued efforts on behalf of the FAIRtax since you've retired. And hopefully we can carry this thing through to completion, and our grandkids will have to ask us, what was it like? What's this IRS thing I hear about in the history books and all like that? But
thank you for
and also we're looking forward to seeing you on these new X Spaces conversations. We'll be hearing more about that on some of the FAIRtax social media accounts. But until we meet again, we're going to have to wrap this up. We're the FAIRtax Guys. I'm Bob Paxton.
Bob Scarborough.
We are the FAIRtax Guys, reminding you, as we always do, the FAIRtax is the only truly fair tax, and once you understand it,
you'll demand it.
So what do you need from me to get these taxes collected?
Glad you asked, because there is a fair amount of information you need to be aware of.
That's your tax plan?
Oh, no, this is just the revisions for this year's tax plan. What I need from you is you need to keep track of all of your income, as well as any taxes that you've already paid. Also, any gifts that you received or gifts you've given to churches or charities or individuals throughout the entire year. Do you do any side jobs?
Every now and again.
Great, because there's some more information about that right here. Everything you need to know right here. So just simply compile that Send it in to us. Be careful, make sure there's no mistakes. If we do find mistakes, or maybe we can fine you or, throw you in jail. So you might want to be aware of that.
And what do you need from me?
As an individual, nothing. As a business owner, or if you're doing side jobs, yes, you would have to collect taxes on that, but, well, it's all right here.